Live, folks. Matthew.
Okay.
Hello, this is Sandy. We're having a few little technical difficulties. Michael, Matthew, please mute yourself.
Okay.
So we're having a few little technical difficulties. Chris is not here tonight. Matthew is here. He's our vice president of CMS, and he's going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Beug. However, Matthew's video isn't working, but his audio is working. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my audio and video and let Matthew just speak to you for a few minutes.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. I want to apologize to everybody today watching. I don't know why, but the modern technology has failed us all.
Go ahead.
Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, Jesus. What now?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Oh, whoops. So anyway, as I was saying, modern technology seems to have failed us once again, but that's okay because I'm here with Michael Beug, and I'm going to introduce him. He's going to talk about.
No Matthew, right?
Yes, Matthew.
Michael, do you hear Matthew?
I do.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so again, modern technology is failing us, but that's okay. We'll get through this. Chris is working tonight on the coast. He does work with owls, and he can't be with us. I'm the vice president, so the introduction of Michael falls on to me. Originally we had Olunda and Adolf Sesko from Victoria, British Columbia. They were scheduled to talk to us this month about the highlights of the Observatory Hill long-term macrofungi inventory, but due to illnesses, they can't be here with us. Fortunately, Dr. Michael Beug offered to step in on short notice and speak. Now, the last time Michael spoke to us was in February of 2021, and this was before his latest book came out, the latest book, Mushrooms of Cascadia, an illustrated guide. For that previous meeting, he talked about the many mushrooms that are featured in that field guide, which is a nice little field guide, fits right into your pack. You can take it out in the woods with you. There's over 900 species and over 1,000 colored photographs in the book. It's an excellent resource to add to your myco resource book collection. I must admit, earlier this evening before this meeting started, I looked through my collection. I've got about somewhere between 15 and 20 reference books. And I apologize, Michael, but I don't have any of your books. I do have 3 copies of Mushrooms Demystified, though. So anyway, Michael, for those of you who don't know Dr. Beug, he's a rock star of the myco community. He taught chemistry, mycology, organic farming at Evergreen State College up in Olympia, Washington for 32 years. He's active with NAMA, the North American Mycological Association, and the Pacific Northwest Key Council. This is a group dedicated to writing the macroscopic keys for identification of fungi. And as some of you may know, they're Susie Holmes, who's often we do stuff with her. She's from here in Eugene. She's part of that key group, as is Molly Widmer. That's Chris's wife, and Ron Hamill as well. He's a friend of all of us. He spends a lot of time here in Eugene as well. They're all in the Northwest Key Council with Dr. Beug. In addition to his new book, he co-authored Ascomyces fungus of North America. That was published in 2014. His photographs have appeared in over 80 publications. He regularly writes about mushrooms for Machiavellia, Journal of American Amateur Mycology, the Mycophile, that's the NAMA newsletter, and Fungi Magazine. In 2006, Michael received the NAMA Award for contributions to amateur mycology. And he has prepared over 24 presentations about mushrooms for the NAMA Educational Committee. In 2017, Paul Stammes of Fungi Perfecti created the Mike Beug Scholarship to honor Dr. Beug and his professorship and his teaching. So with that introduction, Michael, I think we could go on about your other accomplishments, but I think would like to hear, and I believe you're going to talk about what's the title, Why I Should Have Eaten That or Why I Shouldn't Have Eaten That. Go ahead.
Okay, I am ready to go. In just a moment, I'm going to share my screen and get the PowerPoint presentation started. Here we go. Okay, so the title tonight is Should I Have Eaten That Mushroom? Telling the poisonous mushrooms from the edible and hallucinogenic species. And we're going to start with Amanita pantheranoides, which is one of the most commonly eaten, seriously poisonous, but not deadly mushrooms, especially in our region. It's distinguished by a little roll collar vulva at the base of the bulbous stipe, and you can see that very prominently in the left-hand image. The color varies from dark brown to almost yellow, so it's very, very variable in general appearance. The ring on the stipe, which shows clearly in all of these specimens, does not always clearly show. And when you get into the really yellow forms, it's very hard to distinguish Amanita pantheranoides from Amanita gemata. However, it's not hard to distinguish the effects. They're the same, and you don't want to eat it. It's perspiration, salivation. I mean, it's very severe flu-like symptoms followed by a deep coma-like sleep, and that in extreme cases has lasted up to 72 hours. In dogs, sometimes the veterinarians will assume that the dog has died and they'll euthanize it, but you've got to be really patient because virtually, I know of no deaths from this mushroom. People do come out of that coma and do fully recover. Now, Amanita muscaria variety flavivulvatus is the name that I have in my Mushrooms of Cascadia book. And we now, due to very recent DNA results, realize that what we actually have throughout the Pacific Northwest and most of North America, there are parts of North America that has Muscaria variety flavivulvata, but what we have throughout North America is really a mushroom that was named back in 1917, 1918 in Wisconsin, Amanita chrysoblema. And it can have a white cap with warts, a yellow cap with warts, an orange cap with warts, the red cap with warts. But if you look at the base of the stem on that orange one on the far left, you'll see sort of typically 3 rings of tissue around the stem and not that roll color vulva of Amanita pantheranoides. But the toxins are the same. Ibotenic acid and mucimol are the 2 toxins. And the effects are pretty much the same, a little bit milder than it is with Amanita pantheranoides. This mushroom is frequently eaten by people wanting to experience a high. The high is the high described basically in Alice in Wonderland. One bite makes you big, the next bite makes you small. Your perception of time changes. but the difference between a psychoactive dose and a mentally changing dose is very, very narrow, and the overall results are very, very unpleasant. So this legal hallucinogen is one you absolutely do not ever want to try. The toxins, however, are water soluble, and so Russians and other people, and include also David and Aurora, will slice this thinly, do a couple, 3 boils in water, carefully discarding all of the water, and then the mushroom is edible. I've eaten it with David, Aurora, and it was okay, but my question was, why bother? Because I've also had people who've eaten David Aurora's detoxified Amanita chrysoblemas that he didn't fully detoxify, and the effects were not so pleasant. So this is a good mushroom to avoid. Now, the most important mushroom to know and identify is Amanita phalloides and its closest white-capped relatives. So the characteristics of Amanita phalloides, it starts out looking very, very much like an egg, and as the cap erupts out of that vulva, which is the sac that covers it at the base, all of the vulva remains at the base of the stem, forming a cup-like structure. But notice that in 3 of the mushrooms, that vulva isn't seen, it's below ground. So people who just harvest their mushrooms by cutting them off at ground level can eat this mushroom by mistake. It is incredibly delicious. It's one of the most delicious mushrooms in existence, and incredibly deadly. If you were to eat all these mushrooms in this picture, which would be a typical meal, you're probably going to be heading for the hospital, if you're wise, about 6 hours later, because your vomiting and diarrhea will appear to be very, very severe. Now, if you eat a lesser amount or get some of the lower toxic specimen, and there's variability from one collection to another, it might be 12 hours before those symptoms appear, and sometimes even longer. Well, if it's 12 hours, even 9 hours or more, your chances of survival are close to 100% if you get to a doctor, and make sure you don't go to a hospital that has a kidney transplant specialist, because if you do, they're going to transplant your liver, and you're going to be in dealing with anti-rejection drugs and $30,000 a year bills for your drugs to stay alive, where if instead they had just flushed you out with IV isotonic solution, you would have peed out the amatoxins and you would recover. Now, even somebody who gets to the hospital promptly after eating a lot of this mushroom will normally, 90% of the time, survive just by giving that flush out, and you just pee the toxin out of your system. There is no antidote. This mushroom, this toxin is not extracted in hot water. This toxin is not destroyed by cooking. So edible or cooked, it's equally deadly. It's an important one to know how to identify. So here's my quiz for those people who like to eat amanitas, because amanitas are among the most delicious mushrooms in the world. So is it the mushroom on the left that's deadly, or the mushroom on the left that's edible? Is it the mushroom on the right that's deadly, or the mushroom on the right that's edible? One's pretty good eating. It's not delicious, but it's not bad. That's the one on the right. The one on the left, that's an Amanita phalloides. Now notice how both of these are going to start out in that sort of oblong egg shape that you see in the right-hand image. And here in these dugout specimens, you clearly see the base of the stipe of the mushroom. Now, the toxin, amatoxin, is not just limited to the genus Amanita. And so but you really want to watch out for any Amanita that has that vulva at the base of the stem, that cup-like vulva. And regardless of whether the cap is white or bronze or green, they're all equally deadly. But Lepiota subincarnata has the same toxins. It's a fairly significantly sized mushroom. I just heard from Elsie Belinga at Berkeley that this name is going to revert to an older name, Lepiota jozerandii. And if you ate this collection of mushrooms here, again, you need to get to the hospital promptly, get flushed out with isotonic solution IV, and your chances of survival are about 95% if you're prompt. The longer you delay, the more trouble you're going to have. The other problem with this mushroom is after this initial vomiting and diarrhea stage, so far the liver enzymes will still appear normal, and usually about the second day, you appear to recover and the hospital will discharge you and send you home. So you want to make sure you know your mushroom ID so you don't get discharged, and stay there and continue to get that IV, because the amatoxins have gone on to attack the RNA polymerase. That's a competitive inhibitor. I am an enzyme kineticist by profession, and it will be shutting down your liver function. It will cause the production of the chemicals that will lead to blood clotting. That production will cease, and you may literally internally bleed to death if you don't die from the liver damage itself. It's a very, very gruesome way to go, but treat it white. And if you know what you're doing and or have friends that can advise the doctors, or they get in touch with me so that you get the right treatment, you'll make it, even if you make a bad mistake. Now, what was known long as Conocybe phalaris and Conocybe rugosa, those are the names are now Poliotina. And these mushrooms also contain amatoxins. And so they are deadly poisonous. They're a little bit smaller, a little bit more fragile than the Lepiota. And I have no poisoning reports from this mushroom because I don't think anyone has ever eaten enough of it to get in trouble. Now, you could get away with eating 2 or 3 small ones and you won't even know that you've made a mistake. But if you eat enough for a nice little meal like this cluster in the upper left or the lower right, you're in serious doo-doo. Now, this is the mushroom that people commonly eat and mistake for an species. And it's long been known most commonly as Galerina autumnalis, and I have it illustrated in my book. Both autumnalis and marginata, which I thought was a separate species, they turn out to be one and the same. And it's Galerina marginata that's the deadly mushroom. It is mistaken for the honey mushroom, but the honey mushroom has fine warts on the center of the cap, tends to be a bit larger, but these can be big enough that people are tempted to eat it. And it is frequently eaten in North America, but it's also easily mistaken for a psilocybe. Now, this has a sort of a rusty brown spore print. If you look on the veil that's on the stem of a couple of the specimens, you can clearly see that brown coloration where the veil, the top of the veil had caught spores, and you've got a free spore print. And what I found for the first time in my life last fall, and I had been looking for this for a long time, is Galerina castaneipes. It's smaller, but equally deadly. And it was almost dark when I spotted it. This is a great photograph because it took a 25-second exposure in near darkness, but I had to have the picture because I've only seen it once in my life, and that was in late September of last year. I caught this photograph. I've looked for it again and again and again. Haven't seen it again, but it contains amatoxins. And it's distinguished from the Galerina marginata in having a very, very tiny, sometimes completely absent ring on the stipe. So it's a little harder to spot. Don't eat any little brown spored crud mushroom. The mistakes can be very, very serious. So here we see Galerina marginata on the left, and you can see how easily it can be distinguished from a nice psilocybe on the right. Oh, not so easy, is it? The one on the left, though, on the stipe, on the far left specimen, you can see a little bit of a rusty brown color. If you took the spore print of Psilocybe folliculosa, it would be purple brown. Now, Psilocybe folliculosa doesn't bruise blue because it doesn't have that much psilocin in it, and it's only mildly hallucinogenic. But this mushroom has caused at least one death in the state of Washington from Psilocybe foragers who did not know the critical need to spore print the mushroom. So here's the big Psilocybe cubensis that is commonly cultivated, that is now sold openly on the web at many, many different sites. I found this thing growing outside in Olympia. It's a subtropical species. It should be down in Texas and Florida, and it does not belong growing in the wild in the Pacific Northwest. But it has the telltale characteristics of a mushroom with psilocybin and psilocin, and it's the psilocin that causes the blue staining that you see on parts of the stem of two of the specimens. Now, what was this doing growing outside? In talking to the owner who wound up selling these mushrooms and wound up in prison for having done so, he was getting horse manure from a stable that he was spreading around his rhododendrons, and the horse manure was coming from racehorses recently brought up from Florida, and they had live spores in them. And since it was the summertime, the mushroom was able to germinate and grow, and I was able to catch this photograph. And but in the wild, one of our most potent mushrooms and most common hallucinogenic mushrooms is Psilocybe cyanescens. This can be 2% by dry weight psilocybin, plus some other mind-altering chemicals of interest, and where the Psilocybe cubensis at best is 1%. In fact, the stuff that they're now cultivating is typically running right around 1% psilocybin and psilocin by dry weight. So a gram of dried Psilocybe cubensis will get most people pleasantly high, and where a fourth that amount of this mushroom, well, half that amount of this mushroom, half a gram, will get most people high, and that's with sort of a laughing, giggling state, possibly very, very colorful visions. It can be incredibly frightening in the wrong circumstances. People will wind up in the hospital in a state of panic. So these are mushrooms that should only be consumed in supervised settings, and Oregon has just passed an initiative, and I've been working with the Oregon Healthcare Authority on setting the rules for how this mushroom can be used in supervised settings, whether you need to have experienced the psilocybin experience or not. Psilocybin and psilocin can lead to a great reduction in PTSD effects. The studies at Johns Hopkins, and they've been in contact with me a lot in the last few years, show that soldiers suffering from PTSD get about a 70% success ratio but you've got to prepare them over about a 2-week period before you serve them the mushrooms. And then you have to do it in a very controlled fashion and be prepared to help them through the process. It can be terrifying, but they come out often for years cured of their PTSD, often for years cured of their depression. These chemicals are probably the most promising chemicals for dealing with depression, alcohol abuse, spousal abuse, end-of-life anxiety due to cancer. I am incredibly excited by them, but very concerned that they be used very carefully and only in a supervised setting. Now, this is another wild Amanitta. This is the mushroom that, after researching the chemistry of these mushrooms for 10 years, I finally decided to try it once. And I took I collected 200 specimens on the Evergreen State College campus. Nobody paid any attention because I'm always picking mushrooms. And I had a Schedule I drug license. So as long as I didn't eat them, it was perfectly legal. Except I took them to Brighton Bush Hot Springs Resort to a gathering, a psilocybin mushroom gathering with psilocybin experts and people who wanted to experiment with it from all over the world. And I'll talk about that later. But this is 1% by dry weight, very reliable psilocybin and psilocin. Now, Gymnopilus ventricosus, I thought was the only Gymnopilus that we had on the West Coast. The East Coast lookalike to this is mildly hallucinatory, but extremely bitter. And then I just recently learned about the existence of a second mushroom, Gymnopilus voigtkii, named for a colleague of mine from Newfoundland, where he discovered it, and it got named in his honor, Gymnopilus voigtkii, and it is supposedly mildly hallucinatory. And so I spent the last summer and early fall searching for this mushroom, finally finding it about 200 yards from my house in my own woods. And I've only seen it this one time, and here it is, Gymnopilus voigtkii. It is very bitter, not something you really want to experience, but some people are bound to try it. I have analyzed the ventricosus. It doesn't have any psilocybin and psilocin. I mean, chemically analyzed, not personally. And but this one supposedly does, but I no longer run a lab, so I cannot determine whether it was actually contained any psilocybin and psilocin. But supposedly it has a little. Now, this one has a fair amount. This is Gymnopilus luteolens. And you find this up in the Oregon Cascades. In fact, it used to grow on the walls of the steam sauna at Brighton Bush. And so on the hallucinogenic mushroom conferences, a few people figured out, they spotted that blue-green coloration that you can see in some of the caps, and they said, this might be hallucinatory. It's very bitter, but they tried it. It is a mild hallucinatory mushroom. I wouldn't mess with it, but people do try it. Now, the other thing is people love to eat puffballs. Now, all puffballs are edible, not all are choice, but it's really critical that you cut a puffball through the middle, top to bottom, and make sure that when you look at the inside, it looks exactly like a marshmallow. It feels exactly like a marshmallow. It's soft like a marshmallow. This one looks a little different to me. This is Amanita bisporogyra. This is an Eastern look-alike to Amanita phalloides. It has a white cap, but you can see the developing gills and stipe inside. We have a Western look-alike, actually two of them, Amanita ocreata and an Amanita ocreata look-alike, that do both occur in Oregon. They've been found as far north as Vancouver, Washington. It's a low elevation mushroom that you tend to find along the I-5 corridor mainly, but it is in Oregon, so you need to be aware of that mushroom. So, and the mushroom on the bottom is one that I found for sale at a farmer's market in Olympia as a puffball. So here we see when I took it home, when I bought it, took it home and cut it in half, I knew right away it wasn't a puffball because you could see that it wasn't nice and smooth on the outside. Inside, you see the color that tells me that this is going to turn out to be Amanita chrysoblema. Above, you have a puffball. It's a thick-skinned puffball, and but inside you can see that marshmallow-like structure, and if you feel it, it's nice and soft. Now, this particular puffball at the top smells like Well, somebody just did a bad thing in your backseat of your car, because I've picked a bunch of them and carried them home with students, and pretty soon everyone was looking at each other. It's a very foul tasting puffball, but when the puffballs that smell good are all good to eat, this particular one isn't. So when you find a Calvo Vista subsculpta, which can be bigger than a basketball, and you cut it open and it feels like a marshmallow inside, you've got a delicious meal ahead of yourself. I tend to slice it about the thickness of a slice of a white bread, batter it in an egg batter. I like to fry it so it's nicely browned on both sides, like French toast in the morning, and serve it with maple syrup. Now, if it's no longer pure white inside and starting to turn green, don't eat it. It's no longer edible. So the one in the center, where the scales are beginning to break apart and it's changing color, I know if I were to cut that open, it's not going to be pure white inside. It's not a potential edible. The one on the left, which is now still looking very nice outside, probably will be nice and white and be a good edible. So I would harvest that one, take it home, but then when I'm ready to eat it, cut it open, make sure it's still pure white inside, make sure it feels like a marshmallow. It can also be dipped in a tempura batter and served as a tempura mushroom at the dinner table. Now, this mushroom in the Scleroderma cepa group, when it's young, it's also pure white inside, and it looks like a marshmallow. It starts out underground, but it readily erupts from the ground, and so it looks like, and is frequently mistaken for either a truffle or for a puffball. But if you press on that gleba, that's the material inside, and it's still pure white, it'll be firm. It will not be soft like a marshmallow. This mushroom, if you ate the other half of the mushroom at the top and it had been pure white, you would have time to get up from the dinner table, but not time to make it to the bathroom before you were suffering vomiting and diarrhea. The poisoning is so fast and so violent that you normally recover very, very quickly. But I did have a lady recently in the Columbia River Gorge who ate some of these, and she was elderly and very, very nearly died from the experience. And dogs will regularly die from eating this particular Scleroderma. There's a number of Sclerodermas, and but they all are firm. They're not soft like a marshmallow. They're all white inside when they're young, but not soft. Always check. So here are truffles. Are truffles good to eat? Well, some are. Are choice edible truffles like the tuber gibosum in the lower left image? Is that always good to eat? No, it's only tastes like something if it's ripe. You don't want it overripe. You don't want it underripe. You want it to have this incredible cheesy, garlicky aroma that just pervades all of your food. If those four, actually it's three truffles that in that photograph, I would stick them in a jar with foods that are high in fat, in avocado, whole avocados. It'll absorb the flavor right through it. And I'll get a year's worth of meals out of just three tuber gibosum. Tuber lyonii, the pecan truffle, also when it's ripe, it's just literally right on the surface of the ground. So when you're raking up the ripe pecans, and it's the pecan truffle, you're also typically raking up a bunch of these. It's not nearly as delicious as the Oregon white truffle, but it is still quite incredible. And the same is true of Amania gigantea, found by Todd Elliott. This grows in the Blue Mountains, and it can be huge and very, very tasty, delicious truffle. However, Laphomyces americana never smells good, never tastes good, and will probably give you a significant upset stomach were you to consume it. So with truffles, it's all in the odor. If the odor is fantastic, use just tiny amounts as a flavoring. This is one of the few things that I eat raw, shaved onto a meal, and for an incredible meal. And that's the thing to know about truffles. Now, the other thing to really know about a Matsutake harvester. Now, in the West, we have Tricholoma morelianum. In the East, we have Tricholoma magnifilarii, which is the name we used to use out West, but they're genetically different, but the same aroma, the same taste, all of the same features. But out West, we also have Amanita smithiana, which doesn't occur in the East. And this is a real problem because sometimes some people think that Amanita smithiana smells rather like Matsutake. And Matsutake famously smells, as David Aurora described it, as a combination of dirty gym socks and cinnamon red hots. Sometimes I personally find Matsutake to be incredibly delicious and highly prized. Other times I find the flavor to be absolutely disgusting. But that little Matsutake on the left, where the veil is still completely intact, could command, used to be able to command about $100 to $200 each in Japan because it's a phallic symbol. And so it was served and sold for that purpose. Now, the younger generation of Japanese have very little interest in sex, rarely engage in it, and are not at all interested in this mushroom as a phallic symbol. So its value has plummeted worldwide. But a lot of people in this country enjoy it, and at times it's incredibly delicious. So how do you tell it from Amanita smithiana? The stem tapers in the Matsutake from the top to the bottom, winding up pointed. It is so dense you can almost pound it back in the ground. It rarely shows itself above the ground. Often you might just see the very top or the ground pushing up a little bit, and you pull the duff away, and then you see the mushroom. You reach down and rock it around in a little circle and then pull it up. Never dig it out. The Amanita smithiana is more likely to be standing proud, readily observable. It often is pointed like the Matsutake, but it's got a bulb before the pointed stem. It's to me typically smells more like chlorine and bleach than it does like a Matsutake. And most importantly, it's not nearly as dense. If you squeeze it hard between your thumb and first finger, squeeze the stem as hard, nothing will happen. But if you squeeze with all your might, it'll shatter. The Matsutake, unless it's wormy, will not shatter no matter how hard you squeeze it. But even more interestingly, Christian Schwartz recently pointed out to me that if you cut the Matsutake with a knife, it squeaks. And it's a very audible and very distinctive squeak. If you cut Amanita smithiana, no squeak. And by the way, throw away all your old copies of Aurora. Buy Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast by Christian Schwartz and Noah Siegel. In the fall of 2023, they will be coming out with a book that sounds a lot like mine, Mushrooms of Cascadia. But the subtitle is A Comprehensive Guide. It'll be a big tabletop guide covering 720 species of Pacific Northwest mushrooms. My book will have about 400 species that their book won't have. Their book will have about 20 species that mine won't. So if you use my book in the field and their book at home, you're way ahead of anything else you could possibly have in your hands. But even the Mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest is coming out in a new edition in this coming September, and it will be bigger. It'll have more species. It will pair very well with my book because I've got much better keys. But I have photos in Steve's new book. Dr. Ammirati is no longer a co-author. They had a little bit of a blow up, but look forward to that book. But I'm really waiting for Noah and Christian's newest book coming in 2023. And you could also, very interestingly, purchase the brand new, if you're a beginner especially, Mushrooms of BC by the Royal BC Museum. Those folks are importing my book to use as a companion, but that is an excellent beginner's book, and every single species that they cover can be found within 40 miles of my home, and I'm sure they're almost all found in the Eugene area. And so that's Mushrooms of BC. It's a Canadian bestseller, selling out 25,000 copies in the first 2 months. I've sold less than 2,000 copies of mine, but I'm not in bookstores. It's a big difference. So here's some more shots of Amanita smithiana. I really want people to know what it looked like. It's also mistaken for Cathathalasma species. Now that middle photograph with Ben Wu, one of the co-founders of the Puget Sound Mycological Society, is a gag photo. But if the cap is viscid when the mushroom is young, you have a brand new name, Cathathalasma singeri. And if it's not viscid when it's young, it's Cathathalasma ventricosum, which was long known as Cathathalasma imperialis, which we do not have. So our two species, singeri, viscid when young, ventricosum, not viscid when young, but very hard to tell apart because that viscidity very soon disappears. Edible, not incredible. You can't believe how often people mistake Amanita pantherina for Pantheronoides, I should say, for Agaricus augustus. I wonder if you can notice a few subtle differences between these two mushrooms. Like if you look at the underside and notice a slight difference in the color. If you notice the cap and notice a few slight differences in the cap. If you notice the odor, Agaricus augustus has this delightful almond odor. Amanita pantherinoides doesn't. Pay attention to your mushrooms before you eat them. Agaricus augustus is one of the choicest edible mushrooms for most people, but it's important to know that with all mushrooms, some people are sensitive. This mushroom makes me sick as a dog as quick as I eat it, and I know I've identified Agaricus augustus. My son, who's holding the big one, is now in his mid-40s, so it's a very old photograph. It's quite a majestic mushroom, and it grows all over Cascadia. Now, an intriguing thing about Agaricus, but also Chlorophyllum, Lepiota, and Pluteus, but not Amanita. And twist the stem, bend it at 90 degrees from the cap, it will pop off in a ball and socket fashion. Amanitas have free gills, but they don't break in a ball and socket fashion. So Chlorophyllum rhacodes breaks like a ball and socket. Amanita pantherinoides doesn't. Amanita alpinicola contains the same toxins as Amanita muscaria. It doesn't break in a ball and socket fashion. Chlorophyllum molybdoides breaks in a ball and socket fashion, but you don't want to eat that because the gills, while they're white when they're young, and the spores, if you look at them under a microscope, are white. When the spores are mature, they're green. And Chlorophyllum molybdoides most years causes more mushroom poisonings than any other mushroom in North America. Sometimes morels beat out Chlorophyllum molybdoides, but usually this is the hands down winner for causing poisonings because it often grows in lawns, in yards. People love to go out and they say, oh my God, that looks like a delicious mushroom. Chop it down raw. And if you eat it raw, then you won't just have vomiting and diarrhea. It'll be bloody, really bloody, and you'll be bloody sick. So make sure that if you're going to fool around with Chlorophyllum rhacodes, get a spore print and make sure that they're all white spored and not green spored. So here's another shot. Chlorophyllum bruneum on the right, a choice edible, tends to grow on big anthills and other waste things. On the left, Chlorophyllum molybdoides. You can begin to see that the spores are starting to develop on that cap, and it's starting to turn greenish, dark. I can't believe how many times people have eaten Chlorophyllum and Lentinus thinking they were eating Coprinus comatus, one of the top 10 most distinctive choice edible mushrooms that have somewhat of an oyster or clam flavor and odor and texture. It's highly prized, but it very quickly turns to ink. But when it's young, if you grab the stem and the cap and just give a quick tug on the cap, it pops off like a ball and socket. Now, there's a slight subtle difference in the shape of this mushroom, of the Coprinus comatus versus Chlorophyllum Lentinus, that a hell of a lot of people don't bother to notice. Coprinus comatus never expands, is never flat. Its scales are very shaggy, but it's always shaped like a bullet. And that's the trick that you need to know. Now, what about Coprinopsis atramentia? The one that is Coprinopsis atramentaria. The one right above on the right, I don't know what that is. It's probably atramentaria, but it seems to have a little bit of a ring, and atramentaria doesn't have a ring. And this thing has never been analyzed by DNA, so we really don't have a name, and that's why the variety question mark. Now, the one below looks much like and was long known as Coprinopsis atramentaria, but the one that has the sort of the little bit of a knob at the top, almost a nipple at the very top of the cap, and it's a little narrower. It's not as broad in profile. That's Coprinopsis striata. So here's another brand new name for you. All of these I list in my book as varieties of Coprinopsis atramentaria. And all of these, if you were to consume them, you can consume them right up to serving a meal that has alcohol in it. But if you eat even one more bite after you drink some alcohol, you're likely to suffer an antabuse-like reaction. And antabuse is the drug that they give to alcoholics to make them sick if they drink. But antabuse has some problems. So this mushroom was investigated to see whether the coprin, which is the active ingredient that causes those factors, could be used in place of antabuse. But it turns out to be a very carcinogenic substance. And by the way, you can see the spore print is black in these because quite often you get free spore prints in the woods and you don't have to go home and take a spore print. Just look at the cap of a mushroom underneath the cap of an expanded mature mushroom and you'll have your free spore print. Do not eat this mushroom even if you don't drink alcohol. You'll seem to get away with it, but I don't want the cancer risk. And if you drink alcohol as much as 5 days after a meal of this mushroom, you can suffer these effects, which are palpitations of the heart, a very, very flushed feeling, a racing heart. It's very, very scary. And but the risk of cancer isn't worth it. And I can't imagine going 5 days after a meal without having my glass of wine, which I like every night. Now, Omphalotus olivascens and Omphalotus illudens are known as the jack-o'-lantern fungi. They glow in the dark. They are violently poisonous. They're much bigger than mistaken for a chanterelle. So I want you to note the subtle difference between, say, Cantharellus roseocanis. This particular collection came from Colorado, but it's a very, very common mushroom under spruce on the Oregon coast and also under spruce in the mountains. And it sometimes even occurs under hemlock. And Cantharellus formosus, which I first learned as Cantharellus sabarius, but it's genetically different than sabarius, which is limited to Europe. Cantharellus roseocanis used to be sabarius as well, and then it was Cantharellus sabarius variety roseocanis, and now we recognize it as a distinct species. The bottom two are delicious. I like formosus a little better than roseocanis, but sometimes roseocanis wins out. But notice the blunt ridges underneath versus the blade-like gills. Also, if you take either of the jack-o'-lanterns into your room at night, which I did once when I found the eastern jack-o'-lantern for my one and only time in Asheville, North Carolina, I took it in, waited till my eyes were dark adjusted, and then I could literally read the newspaper from the greenish glow from the jack-o'-lantern. And they both glow that same green at night in the dark. But your eyes need to be dark adjusted before you can see that. This is a mushroom that is frequently for a chanterelle. Again, notice some slight subtle differences in what's underneath the cap. Not blade-like gills. I'm sorry, not blunt ridges, but blade-like gills instead. This mushroom has even been mistaken by the descendant of the founder of Scotland when being visited by the horse whisperer from the United States. They thought they'd found sep, which is a king bolete, which has sponge underneath. You need to look at your mushrooms before you eat them. Now, the interesting thing about Cortinarius rubellus, now Orionarius rubellus, because Cortinarius is now 10 genera, not 1. I learned that just 3 weeks ago, and I've been desperately updating all my Cortinarius names. This contains arelanine. It's a very interesting toxin because no adverse effects for a week, sometimes 10 days. So it took decades of deaths in Europe before people recognized and traced the source of the death back to this mushroom. It's a very important one to know, but there's literally only 2 deadly Cortinarius species in all of North America. One, a close look-alike to this that is associated with oaks and has been found only so far at one site in Michigan. And this mushroom, which is found in sphagnum bogs. So this mushroom is found all over North America, all over Europe. It goes by dozens of different synonyms. Some of the Western ones include Cortinarius rainiensis and Cortinarius speciosissimus. But you need to know this mushroom and know it well if you're going to ever eat something that resembles a Cortinarius. But Cortinarius is actually one of the safest genera to mess around with because it just has these 2 deadly species. Now, not all of them taste good, and I don't experiment with them, but you could Cortinarius as long as you avoid those 2. Now we'll move on to the Armillarias. Out west, we have Armillaria solidipes, but the name has bounced back and forth between solidipes and Armillaria orthoiae. And right now it's up in the air which name is going to win out. But it doesn't matter in a way. It's a very distinctive mushroom that I know as the chameleon. And the distinctive feature that allows me to identify it all the time are these little tiny scales in the top of the cap. So you see it on the Ostoiae solidipes thing. You can just barely make out those little fine blackish scales on the top of Gallica, and also on the Armillaria synapina. These are all here, but you will not find it on the eastern Desarmillaria tabescens, which doesn't have a ring, or on the eastern Armillaria mellea, which is the best eating of the honey mushrooms. There's no scales on the cap. And so the eastern one is much easier to mistake for the deadly Galerina marginata. But out west, we have a lot of very serious poisonings from Armillaria solidipes, Ostoiae, hallucinatory events, vomiting, diarrhea, unpleasant effects in about 10% of the people who eat these mushrooms. So I don't mess around with them. They're not that choice of edibles to start with. But the largest organism in existence occupies almost the entire Ochoco National Forest. The second largest mushroom in existence occupies much of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. In both cases, the mushroom is Armillaria solidipes Ostoiae. It's also in Michigan, the 3rd largest organism in existence. And the fungus, the organism, it's really more of an animal than a plant. It's much more closely related. All fungi are more closely related to animals than plants. Is as old as the forest. It's been there for at least 1,000 years, possibly longer. And its mycelium is spread everywhere. But if you test samples from all over the forest, they'll be genetically identical. So we know it's all from that one individual. Very, very interesting feature of Armillaria. Now, Lentinula edodes, one of my top 3 favorite edibles, incredibly delicious. It has actually started to naturalize and grow in the wild on the East Coast, especially down in the Blue Mountains. But out here, you've got to cultivate it. The stems tend to be tough, but you cut off the stem, thoroughly cook it, because it contains a chemical called lentinin. Now, lentinin is an important anti-cancer drug used in Japan. And so we know that about 4% of the people that are treated with lentinin break out in something called shiitake flagellate dermatitis. So this is what happened to a woman who sampled some shiitake at I believe it was an organic, large organic grocery chain. I won't name the chain. The mushrooms were lightly cooked, and she suffered this rash that lasted about 2 to 3 weeks. The first few days, it didn't hurt much, but pretty soon it began to sting and sting and sting. Now, doctors, there's been, the first case I was aware of came from Oregon about 7, 8 years ago. Now I've got lots and lots of reports because more and more people are eating shiitake, and eating raw foods has become more and more popular. So more and more people get the pleasure of shiitake flagellate dermatitis. If you're going to eat shiitake, cook it thoroughly. It's no longer going to be any good as an anti-cancer drug, no longer good as a medicinal mushroom, but it's not going to do this to you anymore, because the lentinin causes the microcapillaries on your skin to rupture and cause this dermatitis. Now, Paxillus species, they were all known as Paxillus involutus, and now I have some names for them. If it's growing under birch, often introduced birch from Europe, but also members of the Betulaceae group, it's Paxillus Coprinus. If it's growing not associated with birch, and it's not nice and pallid in the cap, it's probably Paxillus obscurisporus. And if it's pallid in the cap, it's Paxillus involutus. Brand new data. And you can eat this mushroom, any of these, no ill effect, no noticeable effect at all. It's a little bit sour to my taste. But when you eat it again next year, you may suffer immune-related hemolytic anemia, which is a very serious, potentially dangerous disease. This mushroom is actually a gilled bolete, and if you rub the stem, rub the gills under the cap, and I've done it in the upper right specimen, they rub right off, just like the sponge rubs right off of a bolete. So it is a gilled bolete that I recommend that people not eat ever. People do. You can get away with it 1 year, but you often cannot get away with it a second year. Auricularia americana, and there's a whole bunch of different species, not just americana, both in America and globally. These are collectively called black tree fungus, and they cause Szechuan purpurea, which is an easy bruising and excessive bleeding. So this can be very serious for menstruating women who can have the nightmare menstruation period of their life. It's also very serious for anyone on blood thinners, because you can thin your blood in a combination with this way too thin and have a severe problem. You're going to have to see a doctor. So you have excessive bleeding and bruising. It only happens to a small percentage of the people who consume a meal. This mushroom has very, very little flavor, but it's prized for its texture. So it's popular in soups, popular in many different Asian dishes. But be careful, and especially for women during their period, or for anyone who's on blood thinners. Anosperma maximum. Notice that beautiful blue-green on the base of the stem. That's a false reaction. it does not contain psilocybin or psilocin, it's actually likely that it also doesn't contain any muscarine, the toxin in 90% of all Inocybe species. It might even be edible. I'm not going to try to find out, but a potential edible species. But I don't eat any mushroom that has a thready looking cap where the cap cuticle is composed of these radial hairs. The mushroom tends to split around the margin like that Inocybe metnapipes at the top, which is crammed full of muscarine, which causes perspiration, salivation, vomiting, diarrhea. I've got to set off my medicine alarm. Anyway, don't eat it. And don't eat Clitocybe dialbeta, now Clitocybe rivulosa, also loaded with muscarine, perspiration, salivation, lacrimation. Any of these high muscarine species can kill dogs, rarely kill people because they generally aren't popular edibles. Gyromitra esculenta contains monomethylhydrazine. The toxin is gyrometrin. It breaks down on heating. So if you insist on eating it, cook it outdoors, don't smell it. It's usually the cooks who die after a large meal of this mushroom. But gyrometrin, the decomposition product monomethylhydrazine, is also highly carcinogenic. So I have trouble convincing people they should not eat Gyromitra esculenta. Believe me, don't eat it. Don't eat Gyromitra. They have the same toxins. Don't eat Cudonia circinans, same toxins. The toxins that break down to monomethylhydrazine. Toxin in itself, it can wipe out your liver, and it can cause cancer. However, Gyromitra montana is in a completely different subgenus of Gyromitra. No Gyromitra. Now, it might have some other dangerous hydrazines in it, but it doesn't have Gyromitra. And it can be eaten if it's cooked thoroughly. It's definitely poisonous raw. Cook it thoroughly. I don't find it incredible. I find it hard to clean. I don't eat it. But you can. You can eat any of these mushrooms in this image because they're all closely related to the Gyromitra montana. They're not at all closely related to esculenta. They don't have the toxin. But again, I avoid them all. If you're going to play around with them, cook them thoroughly. People cook up Gyromitra ancilis and the similar mushroom that looks like it, Dicyotis venosa, and they call it camp bacon. But cook it thoroughly, crispy like bacon if you're going to eat it. Morchella america, all morels are toxic when raw. They must be thoroughly cooked. They even cooked, people can eat them sometimes for years and years and suddenly develop an allergy. If you develop an allergic reaction to these mushrooms, cease eating them, because a second ingestion can be worse than the first, and a third and fourth. And by the third and fourth, you risk dying from anaphylactic shock. So be careful with morchellas. Cook them thoroughly. I would call them poisonous if they weren't so incredibly delicious. I seek them and eat them. They're in my top 10 favorite edibles, but treat them with respect. I named the Eohespera, somebody the year before in a sloppy paper named it Morchella norvegiensis, but since he named it before I named it, that name sticks. But this is actually one of the most common mushrooms growing from sea level to 4,000 feet in the mountains, growing under apple trees, deciduous trees, coniferous trees. It's everywhere. It's virtually unknown, virtually unrecognized until I named it in 2016. And yet, one of the most commonly eaten morels in the Pacific Northwest. And it's really meaty, really delicious. Morchella importuna tends to grow around house sites. It grows the year after there's been a slash burn and the ground has been disturbed. It's worldwide, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. It's a weed. It's a decent edible, but not nearly as good as Eohespera. And Gusticeps is a lookalike that grows in the east. Quite a decent edible when thoroughly cooked, but must be thoroughly cooked. Now the burn morels, normally they appear in great quantities 1 year after a burn. But if there was dry weather like last spring, these can be expected to grow in absolutely stunning abundance. And there's 3 lookalike species that will start appearing at the same time that the trillium flowers are starting to turn from pure white to pink when the Calypso bulbosa orchids are blooming. Then you go into the burns and you look for the burn morels. And when both of those are done, you go back to the burns and look for the Morchella tomentosa, a gray morel that's not related to any other morels. It's in its own special group. And it can keep fruiting in ideal conditions until the snow flies in the fall. So you can actually find morels in midsummer, August, September, sometimes even into October, as my friends Barbara and Joe Zimmer discovered when they returned to their burn site again in July and August and September and kept hauling out morels. Listed as poisonous in most books. It's no more poisonous than the true morel. It's a false morel. The cap breaks from this, is not attached to the stem. It hangs like a skirt from the top. So you cut them open from top to bottom down the middle. If it's hanging like a skirt, it's a verpa. If it's attached, it's a morel. And edibility, not so tasty. I don't like it. Some people like it. Cook it thoroughly. I think it's as safe as eating morels if you happen to like it. Now, Sarcospheric corn. Here you see the spore discharge, that little thing. You just tap it on the side, wait about 4 seconds. It's an ascomycete, and it suddenly releases a cloud of spores, and you can catch it if your timing is right. This mushroom starts out as a hollow ball, white inside, turns liliaceous at maturity. It's edible, not at all incredible, unless it's growing on waste ground that is high in arsenic or serpentine soils, like just the ones you find just south and west of Eugene. It'll be high in arsenic. You don't want to eat mushrooms at all from serpentine soils, but this one hyperaccumulates arsenic. Others, like morels, just have arsenic levels that are reflective of the surrounding arsenic levels, but this one will have far more. Caliscypha fulgens, the spring mushroom, is not edible. It's toxic. Luria aurantia, the summer and fall orange peel, doesn't have that greenish or bluish staining. It's edible, tasteless, sometimes used raw in salads. I don't recommend eating any mushroom raw. And that blue-green coloration of Caliscypha fulgens does not indicate psilocybin and psilocin. It's inactive. Then there's the russulas. If they're hot and peppery, I tell people don't eat them. But it turns out that most peppery mushrooms can be eaten if you cook them thoroughly first. They're very, very hard to identify. And for example, I've long said that Russula medica does not grow in North America. That's what I've been long told. Now DNA has shown that we've got tons of it in North America. It can be pure white, pure red. It can have these pink and orange colors, but the gills are always pure white because the spore print is pure white. The cap always peels back in a distinctive fashion. And some of my friends have recently cooked it and eaten it. It's peppery when hot, but it loses that pepperiness on cooking, and they haven't been affected. That doesn't mean it's edible. It means they didn't get sick by it. But if you're experimental, you can mess around with the ones with the russulas that are hot. Just cook them thoroughly. You're taking a risk. I wouldn't do it, but don't eat any of the hard russulas in the compacting group. If they bruise brown or red or black or gray and then get darker in age. Some of these are potentially deadly poisonous, all the deadly poisoning so far in Japan, but I stay away from all of the blackening russulas. But if it's Lentinus or the Brevipes group, which is white, it might be slightly brown in age, they're edible. And some people think they're actually better tasting than chanterelles. I don't agree. So here's some Lactarius species. The one on the left, Olympianus, is very, very peppery. I don't recommend eating it. Lactarius deliciosus complex, there's a whole bunch of species. We don't have the European Lactarius deliciosus, which I understand is delicious. Ours are the not so delicious milky caps and the truly awful tasting delicious milky caps. Lactarius rubrulacteus is similarly unimpressive, somewhat grainy in flavor, but you can eat it, cook it thoroughly. Watch out for that bleed milk that changes color or that are very, very fuzzy. They can give you a severe stomach upset. Lactarius glyciosimus is interesting because it smells like coconut, but it doesn't taste like coconut. It tastes awful. I don't mess around with many Lactarius. Lactiflorum is a parasite that attacks Russula brevipes and related russulas that don't blacken, and it's considered edible and decent. I'm not fond of it, but it has a very nice texture and it's good at taking up the flavors of whatever you cook it with. Lateritius, which is an eastern species, but I found it recently out west as well. It's much rarer. It's also edible, but Hypomys, Chrysospermus and Microspermus both turn the mushroom into a fetid mush. So Hypomys lactiforum can make mushrooms that are not that great to eat better, but it can also ruin mushrooms that are great to eat by turning them into mush. Now, if you're going to eat boletes, and I eat more boletes than anything else, avoid the ones that have sort of an orangish or reddish sponge underneath, especially if they bruise blue. This is Boletus pulcherimus, which has been known as Boletus satanus. The agents are unknown, but you get severe poisonings and even one death on the West Coast from these things. So watch out, know your mushrooms. Lexinum discolor for years and years. And then I learned that some people can eat this for 10 or 20 years, suddenly get sensitive, and they wind up with severe flu-like symptoms. They can last for 2 weeks. I no longer eat any Lexinums. They're distinguished by these little scales on the stem. They're called scabers, and it's very distinctive. Lexinums, don't eat any Lexinums is my recommendation. If you do, cook them thoroughly and don't pig out. You might turn out to be sensitive, or you might develop sensitivity down the line. Stick to Boletus granulus, Boletus rosei, all members of the Edulus complex. They have white sponge when they're young, a netted stem, just incredibly delicious, nutty mushrooms. They're even, when they start to turn, the sponge starts to turn greenish, then I tend to dry them or take the sponge off and turn them into duck cells quickly. I prefer using the stems. The duck cells are just finely chopped mushrooms, sauteed till they're almost dry. And then I add some wine and nice sweet apple wine or a nice sweet sake, evaporate that down again until they're almost ready to burn. Then freeze them in freezer trays. They'll keep for a year or two. Carissima beatus in my top 2 favorite edibles. Carissima arenaceus in my top 1 favorite edibles. It has a fantastic lobster flavor. It doesn't grow in the Pacific Northwest unless you know what the heck you're doing. You can find a half a dozen in a day. And some of them, like the one in the upper left photograph, I cut it into fourths, and each fourth fed half a dozen people. It had this incredible lobster flavor. Carissima americanum, which grows on hardwoods, is not quite as tasty, but it's an incredibly important mushroom. All of these mushrooms help regenerate nerve cells, help forestall Alzheimer's, especially when used in combination with a microdose of psilocybin plus 50 milligrams of niacin, vitamin B3. Finally, Know your mushrooms. Don't pass up Boletus edulis. Check out mushroomsofcascadia.com. Use MycoMatch to identify your mushrooms. Have fun. It's an incredible hobby. And that's the end. So, questions? Sorry, I
Wow.
overran a bit.
Fabulous as always, Michael.
This is brand new, just for you guys. Nobody's seen it yet. You're the first.
This was awesome. The amount of new information for me was, I'm furiously writing down new names, and hopefully I can keep all of this in my head. But yeah, this is just Michael. I just think this was really nice. You crammed so much information in there.
Yeah, and throw away Aurora. He's a good friend of mine, but it's 40 years overdue for, he'll drive up to see things that I've found that he's never seen before. We're buddies, but.
Well, and so I do have, as I was saying, I don't have any of your books, but I do have Mushrooms of the Redwoods. And I love it. And that has sort of replaced Mushrooms Demystified for me. I don't know about others. So Sandy, questions?
Correct. Let me see. Do we have, I'm trying to see whether we've had any that I maybe have missed. What about? Oh, I tell you what, if you have a question, type it in. That way I'll know it's current. I have one question. You mentioned the green sport.
Chlorophyllum molybdites.
Exactly. Does that grow in this area? Is that picture from your property?
No, it doesn't grow here. It's down in California, except with climate change, it's now showing up in Eastern Washington. So the likelihood that if you don't have it yet, you'll see it soon. You better know it.
Okay, I totally agree. I just know it as a more subtropical whatever.
Yeah,
so.
no, it's not subtropical. It poisons people like mad in places like Colorado, California, the whole East Coast now, clear up into Canada. It's spread that far north.
Got it.
It's moving north.
I was going to say about 10 years ago, I was in Toronto and I found it. It's the only place I've ever found it.
Yes. I haven't seen it myself since I left Los Angeles and quit teaching at Harvey Mudd College to come to Evergreen. But it's there. It's out there. Well, I've seen it on the East Coast. I've seen it in Colorado, but not yet here, but it's here.
So, okay, so we do have a question here. And actually, I think your talk tonight has already answered this question, but I will say it because I know you know a lot about this. How strong is the evidence for stimulation of neuron growth for the lion's mane?
Well, I
think it's doing very well for you.
Look, I use that combination 5 days a week. After 10 years of psilocybin psilocin research, I went to Brightonbush with Kit Skates, Gary Linkoff, Linnea Gilman. I'm the only non-NAMA officer in that group before, with Maggie Rogers as our safety, with medical doctors nearby. We all consumed 15 Liberty caps. Gary and Linnea, as expected, were giggly, happy, and left for this lecture about psilocybin and psilocin. And Kit and I looked at each other disappointed. So we ate 30 more each, no effect. And a half hour later, ate 30 more each, no effect. Half hour later, finished off the remaining members of the 200, still no effect. We went to this lecture about by Terrence McKenna about how psilocybe mushrooms were actually beings from Mars who had invaded the Earth. Gary's sitting there heckling the heck out out of Terrence, and I'm sitting there very disappointed. Kit's very disappointed. No effect. Somebody's passing around a big bag of psilocybe cyanescens, so I consumed quite a bit of those. Walking out, somebody was standing by the door. I consumed a double handful of psilocybe cubensis. Kit didn't have the cyanescens or the cubensis. I walked her and Maggie back to their cabin in the woods, said goodnight, joined a friend who was a psilocybe baeocystin researcher and a wine lover like me. We shared 3 bottles of wine. And a couple hours later, I went back to my cabin, just in a drizzly rain, terribly disappointed, everything normal until I closed my eyes, left the planet, wasn't sure I would ever come back. Decided it was the worst mistake of my life when I suddenly, exactly 6 hours after I had ingested the last mushrooms, I sort of felt my body jump. The mushroom had released me. I was back to normal, except driving home about an hour into the half hour into the drive, I was driving straight up the backbone of the Cascades because I go straight to I didn't yet have a house at my vineyard in Houston. And I was panicked. I couldn't control the car anymore. I got out. The left front tire was totally destroyed. It wasn't the mushrooms, it was that. But after that, I was very emotional. I cried at anything. It made me a very sensitive, a very caring individual. In fact, that's why Nixon banned the use, the consumption of psilocybe mushrooms, because it made people too caring for each other. It made it hard for them to go to war and fight the Vietnam War. In Asia, just the lion's mane mushroom with vitamin B3 with the niacin is used to treat Alzheimer's. But if you add psilocybe, add a microdose to that, not enough to cause any mental disturbance. I use 0.2 of a gram and no mental effect at all, but I feel more at peace. I sleep better. And I've seen the test tube results showing the neuron growth far greater than with the psilocybe alone or the lion's mane alone, or better than the two together. There's a synergistic effect. So I believe, I'm a firm believer. And also on this subject of medicinal mushrooms, Paul Stamets recently sent me an Asian study, a retrospective interview of around 60,000 Asian people. And they found that the people who ate mushrooms, edible mushrooms, at least 3 or 4 times a week, and I'm not talking about specific medicinal mushrooms, just had mushrooms in their diet, much lower levels of dementia, much lower levels of cancer, and a longer life. Edible mushrooms are all medicinal as far as I am now concerned. But I didn't touch psilocybin again until I started microdosing in the middle of summer, when I began to fear that I was suffering advancing Alzheimer's. My wife is already halfway down her journey to full-scale Alzheimer's, I believe. I'm on the board of a new company to make this available. There's an initiative in Washington to make it legal in the same way it's legal in Oregon, not for open use, but for supervised use. That's how it needs to be done. It works. Long answer.
That's okay, Michael. That was got a little bit scary there. I noticed
it's scary.
At the beginning of you talked about psilocybin and talked about how you needed to be in a controlled environment, and then you got on this long story, but that's fine. I mean, I'm glad it turned out well for you.
Well, look, I'd been researching the mushroom for 10 years.
I know,
knew
Michael,
that there was no LD50.
I would never do that myself.
I had safety. Kit wanted to know what it would happen. She's the honorary third grandmother of my children. I had to honor her wish. Gary Linkoff and Linnea were eager to join me. They were both experienced. Kit and I were not.
Okay. So, do we have any more questions? We did have people asking about your book, so I put the website out there, and
Good.
that they could purchase it at Fungi Perfecti.
Right, correct. And the club can purchase it in quantity from me or from Britt Bunyard, and then sell it as a fundraiser.
Correct.
And you get it at the wholesale price, and then the club gets a fundraiser out of it if you go that route.
You do
But
have an
I
offer
like
to
people
come
to
over
buy
for
from
some
Fungi
wine.
Perfecta. What?
You have an offer from Sharon to come over for some wine.
Oh,
Any other questions? I think people are just still trying to drink it all in. There was so much information.
Well, I didn't want to waste your nickel, you know.
Do you have any questions, Matthew? I thought you might ask him about Amanitas. And Matthew actually has a little bit of knowledge on Muscaria.
well, I'm interested that it is not Muscaria anymore. It's Chrysoblema, is that right?
Correct.
Yes.
And so my wife has been making a tincture with it, and then she has some nerve issues in her back and her hips and her legs, and been doing making a tincture and doing a topical application, and she swears by it.
My experience with those tinctures is that you don't have the same psychological problems that you have with ingesting the mushroom. I do a similar thing using CBD with a little bit of THC, a little bit of marijuana in it, extracted into coconut oil. Now, if you were to eat a pea-sized bite of what I make, you'd be way gone. But if you spread it on your body, you get really significant pain relief. My wife uses a massive amount of it, no psychic effects, good pain relief.
Yeah, well, and so we've been trying to tell other people about it and how effective it is, and I think at this point it's still a pretty well kept secret, but maybe it'll get out there.
Well, there's a number of other mushrooms that are used in a similar fashion. I have a friend in Alberta that I order these creams from, and I've got a range of different creams, some for prostate cancer, some for quickly curing pneumonia, the flu, and probably curing COVID. I've got at least one pretty convincing piece of evidence that somebody had fairly severe COVID and used the cream that I'm talking about, and it was gone the next day. So, but you wouldn't want to ingest that cream. It's way too strong, but applied, it's very, very powerful. And the turkey tail cream applied to prostate, applied to the breast for breast cancer, appears to be, especially in conjunction with some oral turkey tails, a really powerful combination. And you can get the dose way up safely with the cream.
Well, that's awesome. That's really really awesome. So Sandy, I think we should probably wrap this up if there's no more questions out there.
Well, there was a comment. I'm not sure. It's maybe a really long answer though. Is Dylan was curious about the edibility of Cortinarius. I do know that some people in Europe eat them. Is there anything that's new that's come out as far as edibility or?
Well, what was remarkable to me in looking at the NAMA database on poisonings, there's one poisoning, now two poisonings from Cortinarius, and they were both from the rubellus and the rubellus lookalike. And then one minor GI event from some, I don't know what Cortinarius it was because it was never identified, but the absence of poisoning from Amanita compared to hundreds of poisonings from edible Agaricus and hundreds of poisonings from chanterelles and everything you can name. Cortinarius is absent. Some of them are delicious. I don't know which ones are. Some of them are kind of dreadful tasting. I haven't played with them. I'm too busy eating king beliche, chanterelles, and morels, and especially things like lion's mane and bear's heads. So I don't mess with them. But I think if you want to experiment, as long as you know what rubellus and its lookalike, which we haven't found out here, but it's only under hardwoods. If you know what those are, you can safely experiment. I've tried unknown mushrooms on large groups like on Oregon Mycological Society field trip, and we found out they were edible. I was pretty sure they'd turn out to be edible. I do it from time to time when I'm confident. I'm not ready to fool with quartz, but if somebody is, Daniel Winkler is experimenting with everything right now. We may have some better data soon.
Well, I do know that the violaceous is sold in the markets in Europe. I've seen
Oh, it
them.
tastes terrible.
Oh, okay.
That I do know.
Edible, but not incredible. Okay.
Far from it.
Well, but they're such a pretty color. I'm sure they add something to the appearance of a meal.
Yeah, but there's other ways to add appearance to the meal. Use blue chanterelles, polyozellus.
Well, you know, you use what you can find, I guess.
Well, yeah.
Okay. So Matthew, you want to tell us about next month's meeting?
Okay. Well, so thank you, Dr. Beug.
I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you.
Okay. That was a wonderful presentation. We're always happy to have you, and again, whenever. So next month, we will be hosting Joshua English. He is the co-founder and CEO of Occam Works Labs. He is a regenerative materials researcher and designer, and he's going to be talking about mycelium as building materials. So growing mycelium, I don't know. I've seen videos about people growing mycelium to replace sort of foam and stuff in packaging, and this I've read about. It's been a while, but I've read about people actually doing that for building materials, and apparently they make very strong building materials. They have a lot of they don't squish down. So anyway, the Joshua English, he will be our speaker next month. And with that, is anybody still here listening?
There's still 47 people watching.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you all for being here. If any of you are not CMS members, I urge you to join. It's still incredibly inexpensive to be a member. We should be announcing, we're going to start planning very soon at least one morel foray in probably May, and another foray probably in June to look for the Rex Verus, the spring bolete that is absolutely one of my favorite mushrooms to eat. So everybody stay tuned, and there are more mushrooms to come. Thank you for being here, and unless there's anything else, Sandy?
No, I think that's it. I think we're
Okay.
good.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.